For more than a century, scientists believed they knew what killed the Neanderthals: climate change, competition with modern humans, disease, violence. Each theory had evidence behind it. Each one found supporters, and each one left enough unanswered questions that the debate never fully closed. The extinction of our closest evolutionary relatives remained one of the most contested questions in all of human science. Then, ancient DNA ended the argument, and what it revealed was not a dramatic catastrophe, not a conquest, not a plague. What it revealed was something far quieter, and, in many ways, far more devastating. Neanderthals were not wiped out by modern humans. They were already dying. Their collapse had been written into their own biology thousands of years before the first modern human ever set foot in their territory. The end, when it came, was not a defeat. It was a conclusion that the genetic record had been pointing toward for a very long time. They were not myths or primitive brutes. They were people, hunters and tool makers who controlled fire, created complex tools, cared for their injured and elderly, and survived in Eurasia for more than 300,000 years. They endured ice ages that would have destroyed most modern human populations. They adapted to some of the harshest environments on Earth, with a sophistication that continues to surprise researchers every time new evidence emerges. For 300 millennia, they persisted, and then, in a span that barely registers on the prehistoric clock, they were gone. The answer began not with a dramatic excavation, but with fragments. A tooth, a shard of bone, pulled from cold caves in the Altai Mountains of Central Asia, including Denisova Cave and Chagirskaya Cave. For years, those remains sat in museum drawers. Then the sequencing technology arrived that could read what the bones had been holding in silence. What emerged from those sequences was unsettling. Neanderthals were not just rare at the end. They had been rare for a very long time. High-coverage Neanderthal genomes revealed long stretches of identical DNA on both copies of the same chromosome, a pattern known as runs of homozygosity. This is a genetic signature produced by small, isolated populations, breeding within themselves across generations. It appeared not once, not in one location, but repeatedly. At Vindija Cave in Croatia, at Spy in Belgium, at Mezmaiskaya in the Caucasus. The same signal in different places, across different time periods. Neanderthal populations were not branching outward the way healthy, expanding populations do. They were folding inward. Ancient DNA allowed scientists to estimate effective population sizes from these genomes. The numbers were not measured in tens of thousands. They were measured in low thousands, sometimes lower, and that matters enormously because small populations live permanently close to the edge of probability. In tiny isolated groups, chance becomes lethal. Harmful mutations accumulate and spread, rather than being diluted by incoming diversity. Essential genes can be lost entirely across just a few generations. A single harsh winter, a failed hunt, an illness moving through a group of 30 people hits with a force that the same illness moving through a population of 30,000 simply cannot replicate. The Neanderthal Y chromosome lineages were unusually uniform. Their mitochondrial DNA passed exclusively through the maternal line, narrowed across time like a river entering a canyon. Even the physical archaeology told the same story. Fewer families, shorter occupation layers at cave sites, kin groups clustered within walking distance of one another rather than spread across broader territories. This was not the signature of a thriving species. It was long-term fragility, written into the biology of a lineage that had been contracting for far longer than anyone had previously understood. Then the clock moved. Between roughly 60,000 and 45,000 years ago, modern humans expanded out of Africa and into Neanderthal territory. They moved along coastlines, river systems, and open steppe, carrying something the Neanderthals did not have: broader social networks, the ability to exchange tools, ideas, and mates across hundreds of kilometers rather than the few dozen that define Neanderthal social geography. We know the two populations met because the evidence is still inside us. Most people outside Africa carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal ancestry scattered through their genomes. Collectively, as much as 20% of the total Neanderthal genome survives in living human populations today. But the exchange was asymmetric. modern human DNA flowed into Neanderthals. Then it slowed almost to nothing. The genetic rescue that fresh diversity could have provided never arrived in sufficient quantity or consistency to reverse what was already happening. Meanwhile, Neanderthals remain broken into small islands of population, a valley here, a cave system there, each group with too few people to buffer the blows of chance, too isolated to benefit from the innovations and genetic diversity circulating through the much larger modern human networks expanding around them. The laboratory evidence mounted until it became impossible to interpret any other way. At Chagorskaya Cave in Siberia, genetic analysis revealed a community so small that a father and his teenage daughter were recovered from the same occupation layer. At Mezmaiskaya in the Caucasus, mitochondrial DNA sequences across individuals separated by thousands of years were so similar that researchers initially suspected contamination. They did not have contamination. They had evidence of a population that had never meaningfully expanded. One cave layer preserved what appeared to be a family cluster. A father, a daughter, uncles, cousins, a frozen snapshot of a society that had been shrinking for generations before that particular fire went cold. No massacre appears in the DNA, no single catastrophic event. What the genomes show instead is drift, the slow genetic lottery that small isolated populations almost always lose. Add mild competition for game and shelter from incoming modern humans. Add environmental instability from shifting climate. Add the possibility, still debated, of disease exposure to pathogens the Neanderthals had no prior immunity against. None of these forces alone would doom a large, connected population. Together, operating inside small, isolated groups already stretched thin by millennia of demographic fragility, they tilted the table in a direction it could not recover from. This is not a story about intelligence or capability. Neanderthals were sophisticated in every meaningful sense of that word. The evidence for that is overwhelming and continues to grow. But they survived in small, isolated groups. And in evolutionary terms, that structure is a death sentence written in slow motion. When modern humans arrived with larger populations, wider networks, and the demographic resilience that comes from genuine connectivity, they did not need to wage war. They simply needed to exist. The contrast was decisive without requiring deliberate conflict. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations had contracted to a handful of final refugees. The genetic evidence from these last populations shows them to be even more inbred, even more isolated than those that came before. They were the endpoint of a decline that had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years before the first modern human appeared on the horizon. Ancient DNA did not give us a villain. It gave us a cause. And it gave us something rarer than a dramatic extinction story. It gave us the truth. Neanderthals were not destroyed. They were not outcompeted in any simple sense. They faded, one small group at a time, victims of a mathematics they could not escape. The numbers grew too small. The networks grew too tight. And a lineage that had survived everything the Ice Age could throw at it finally ran out of the one thing that evolution cannot replace on short notice: each other.